Hello, welcome. I'm Steve Watson. I'm here at Sunday Farm, and it is dusk. A couple of lights were just turned on. The candles have been going for a little while, and the sun's going down. And I was recently asked an interesting question, and I thought, boy, I don't know that the forum in which the question was asked would be suited for the way I might answer it or begin to address it. So that I could finally write a book, but that's a long ways off, I imagine. If it came up in class, I'd just kind of address it in class and talk about it. Um, and I thought, well, let me just hit record and talk. A whole lot less engaging for me. I prefer to have some people in the room and interact and see that they're following, or if I need to follow up. But I give it a whirl and see how we go. And so the question was about male and female, uh, and specifically yin and yang. Uh, if you're interested, it's yin with a flat tone, and then yang, yang with a rising tone. These are the characters here, yin and yang. You can see that they are rather similar to one another. They each have the same radical, the same left hand component. And in fact, the components on the right are somewhat similar as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We can see the yin yang diagram, thanks to Harry for offering me this handmade yin yang with the bagua around. So to start with, what are yin yang? Well, we can't say. We'll get into that, I think. I mean, we can say, we do say, but we can't land on it. It's a little bit like saying, what is love? We can't say. We're going to try. I mean, we're humans, we're poets. We feel love. We feel love lost. We feel love misunderstood and love missed. And so we do write about it, talk about it, sing about it. But we can't quite put our finger on it. It's not a table. It's not a cup of coffee. It's not a tree. It's this idea. It's like grasping a cloud. You can reach for it. You can be within it. You can be near it, proximate. The cloud can respond to your hand, but you can't touch the cloud. And yet the cloud touches you, right, in a poetic way. So, what I think is most important here when we think about male female, when we think about yin yang, um, is to recognize yin yang as adjectives. I think that's what's of primary importance. Yin and yang are not destinations, locations, places. They don't have an unchangingness about them. We often think about them that way, that the thing that is yang is this direction in relation to me, or that direction in relation to me, or this direction in relation to me, or that direction in relation to me. That yin and yang are there, that they're these absolutes, and I might be approaching them or receding from them, but they are somewhat absolute. When we think of things like, locations on a map that way. I'm not in Kansas City right now, but I am X distance from Kansas City. And if I started walking, I'm either walking towards it or away from it, or I suppose I'm walking and keeping it equidistant from my throughout my path. So I think that people that study Taoism and people that study things that are related to Taoism or dependent on Taoism or Taoist influenced often come to it, and as soon as you come to Taoism, Yin and Yang is right there, like lesson one, uh, and we adopt this sense that Yin and Yang are these absolute things. And I think that it's far, 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 far more helpful to consider them as adjectives. How yin is something, to what extent does something seem yang to me now? Not is it yin or is it yang, but is it seeming yin or yang to me? Which adjective do I apply to it? So the traditional example I give is I just grabbed this candle here, which I suppose if I was a better content creator, I would have had lit. And I grabbed this little votive, which also is not lit. And I'd say, well, which is uh, larger? Well, obviously, this is a larger candle, and that's the smaller candle. I mean, that's a pretty easy one. So we could say that this is the large candle, this is the small candle. So this is large. And let's say we think in this context, large is yang. So this is yin, it's very small, and this is large, this is yang. Remember, this is yang because we know this is the yin one. So my yang candle, which has not changed at all, it's precisely the same weight and volume, mass, is now yin because I went and found myself a larger candle. So the question then is, when we were so sure a moment ago that this was yang and this was yin, was this indeed yang? Well, no. Well, yes. Now that's interesting. It was yin and yang because the other candle was here all along. We just didn't focus on it. And interestingly, if we were thinking of the mass, this is yang and this is yin, except this one is dim and this is lit. This is warm, this is cold, this is ceramic. So this is yang, this is yin, but the masses haven't changed. But on the other hand, this is liquid wax and this is solid. So maybe that's yin and this is yang. I can give you more examples, but that's going to probably burn me. It's definitely hot. So again, I say it's definitely hot, but if I was in the Sahara, I don't know that I would describe that candle as hot compared to the sand outside, or perhaps to the coffee on the boil in the house. That's hot. This is warm or cold in comparison. So when we had that middle-sized candle and we realized it's both yin and yang, that's a very important idea. We have these two ideas of yin and yang, and we think that they're separate, and yet they're always drawn in the diagram as mutually dependent, mutually interdependent. They're drawn as a diagram, a notion. And yet we have these two names of them. So we sort of rather insist on them being separate. And then we can compare them. And one can be here and one can be there. One can be St. Louis, one can be Seattle. So is something yin or is it yang? Yes. What I mean by them being adjectives is that when we changed what we were comparing this middle-sized candle to, we decided to change the adjectives. When I compared it to something smaller, I decided it was yang. When I compared it to something larger than it, I decided it was yin. And yet, when I had just described it as yin, when I compared it to something smaller that was warmer, I decided that rather than it being yang, it is now yin. It hasn't changed, right? So a noun we might expect not to change. The table is the table is the table remains the table. But the adjectives change. So I've lived in this area my whole life. I'm, very much at home here. I live in Connecticut, and I'm definitely not rich. Right? And I know, I'm not. I'm not a rich person. But I imagine that if I um, flew down to Peru and I hiked up into the mountains, I'd meet people who all understood immediately that I was rich. And maybe I would then understand that I have been rich. My bank account hasn't changed. I mean, I guess I bought the ticket there, but I haven't materially changed. But I'm changing what I'm comparing myself to. So, an interesting thing about adjectives is that we apply adjectives to things like this. So, for example, I ordered this and I thought it was fuchsia, and I don't know any better. I still think it's fuchsia because it said fuchsia and I ordered it. But then an art teacher saw it and she said, "Oh, that's not fuchsia. That's hot pink." The color hasn't changed, but the adjective has changed. Like its actual objective color hasn't changed. But in my context, just kind of talking colloquially to an uneducated art person, yeah, it's fuchsia. That's accurate enough. To the art student, the art teacher, that's not accurate enough. We need to call that what it is. It's hot pink. But I'm sure somebody that works at the Pantone Corporation says, well, it's not exactly hot pink. It's 371648-7 from 1978. That's the color, or whatever. But somebody with a mass spectrometer would call it something else. So the point is that when I call it fuchsia, that's close enough for me. But if I was talking to somebody else, the adjectives might change. And that's fine and that's fair. Adjectives seem to stick to things that we apply them to, but they do not stick. My calling something big does not accurately describe it. It cannot, it does not, it will not, it never can. I mean, I think it does. It seems to. And if I was left to my own devices and nobody ever saw this but me, I'd be happily thinking it's fuchsia for my whole life. If I call somebody thin, that seems to describe them, that they seem hairy or freckled or thin or loud or old, whatever description, blonde, whatever the description is. But all I am describing is how they appear in relation to me or my expectations or my worldview or my context. So I'll just say to me. So for me to call somebody young, assuming I wouldn't guess somebody's age wrong or something, anybody that I would call young would obviously be younger than me. Anybody that I would call old would be older than me. But somebody else calling, so if I called somebody older than me by 10 years, old or older, something like that, somebody 105 years old would call them, a young, a youngling. So what I'm doing by describing them as old is I'm describing myself. I'm describing my perspective. I'm describing where from I see something. And this is true of any adjective I use. Always. Any adjective I use always fails to accurately stick to what I believe it sticks to, what I'm trying to stick it to, what I'm trying to apply it to or throw it at. The adjective only describes me. where I'm coming from, how I see it. So if I describe somebody as strong, I'm describing them relative to me. And if I describe somebody as old or young or slow or rich or whatever, it's always in relation to me or my expectations, my context, my worldview, my lifestyle. So if I was to describe somebody as female, I'm describing them in relation to me or my expectations. If somebody was transgendered, how I describe them is going to be based on my expectations or in comparison to me. The description does not accurately meet them, land on them, stick to them. It cannot. It only tells you something about me because the person that I've described is both male and female. Every person is. Every person is. Perhaps to varying degrees. Maybe it's not a precise 50-50 like we see in the diagram. But the person that chooses to describe it one way is really just describing how they're seeing it, where they're seeing it from, what their perspective is, whether or not that perspective is conscious or fully understood or purposefully stood in. I still cannot help but describe. The only reason I call this fuchsia is that I'm not very educated in art and color theory, so that works. Somebody else would describe it as Pantone 1157-02, 1971, is going to describe that because they've come from this educated place. They're just describing themselves. So, yin and yang, the characters, it's a character of like a mountain range or a hillside, I guess we could say. And one has the character for hillside and a moon. So we suggest night time, or we suggest dimmer light. And the other, you could probably guess, is a hillside. On this side, that's the yang, with the sun, Taya. So we have the hillside and then Yue, and then we have the hillside and Taya. And so we kind of have this idea of maybe shadowed or dimly lit mountains, the yin, and that would be the feminine side. And then we have the more brightly lit, sunny hillside, and that's the yang. But only in the abstract, in the construct that I can have in my mind, is anything purely male or purely female, or indeed only one of the two. The lesson of the Tai Chi Tu, what this diagram is called, I can't point to it apparently, but this diagram is that everything that is a thing is made up of these two qualities, expressions, maybe as expressions is nice, and perhaps at different times I'm shifting to a higher expression of the feminine or a higher expression of the masculine, and then somebody else might say you're acting very femininely now, or you're acting like a man right now. It doesn't really describe how I'm acting. It describes where you're seeing it from, how it compares to you or your expectations, your point of view, your perspective, your expectation, your worldview, your context, your background. It can't describe me. And yet I change. I variously express. So what's the difference between a transgender person and I don't know what the term is exactly, cisgendered or a person called male and only male and ever thus? What's the difference? None. There's no difference in terms of philosophically, right? There might be a psychological difference, and there might be a medical difference, there might be an anatomical difference. But everybody's different, everybody's varied. But where we don't differ is that nobody is absolutist. because they can't be a thing, right? The Tai Chi Tu is a description of the world in which the world comes into being only because or only when there are these two expressions that are integrated, intermingling, co-creative, codependent, co-arising, um, yeah, mutually interacting expressions. So yin and yang um, are anything that I describe as yin is just me telling you something about myself. Anything I describe as yang is just telling you something about myself. And it may only be telling you something about myself right now because I can change. So, what I called yang earlier in the morning when I was very sleepy might be something I'd call yin now, right? Like, even getting dressed might seem very yang to me early in the morning, like, oh my God. But right now, oh, just getting dressed. I'm up, I've had coffee. I'm like, yeah, let's exercise. We're getting dressed. That's like the most yin thing I could do. So, sure, so it's important to recognize that while people may be using terms to describe different people as masculine or feminine, male or female, or yin or yang, um, the person doing the describing can change and necessarily must change. Enough, soon enough to your liking? Oh, who knows? But that isn't our work. In Taoism, our work is self, not other. And the self contains the other. So, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Love, love, love.